Hi everyone. Okay, so I am going to do a couple of short videos on theory. Okay, the first theory that we're going to take a look at, and this would be familiar to you if you were in the Com 70 media class, is muted group theory. Now, muted group theory suggests that within every given society, there are groups of people who are simply not represented equally. And therefore, when a society does not equally represent an entire demographic, an entire group, the society writ large renders them inarticulate or muted by the media. Now, this is really a theory about power and power hierarchies. Who's in charge? Who speaks for who has voice and agency, who upholds the status quo, and who does not. And one of the ways that we look at power is by taking a look at who has it, who does not have it, and how those in power use their hierarchical positions to make decisions on behalf of the otherwise marginalized group. Okay, so again, who is muted, who does not have a voice, who is in charge, who is making decisions, and the like. So to demonstrate this particular theory, we're going to watch this video, and I really hope it works. If not, I'm going to put a link to it anyway on our course site.
Jose Carlos Morales is on his way to the remote headwaters of the Umbira River in Brazil. The dense Amazon forests below are home to one of the last uncontacted tribes left on Earth. Morales works for Brazil's Indian Affairs Department, and his job is to monitor the tribe's lands for signs of invaders.
Primeiro que são povos meio que desconhecidos, né? É difícil convencer até o próprio Estado, né, que eles existem.
But the pressures on these forests are growing, and Morales knows that he has to convince those who doubt the tribes live here at all. For the first time, he's allowed a BBC film crew to travel with him. Powerful zoom lenses will allow them to film from a kilometer away and minimize disturbance.
E não acreditando que eles existem, não vai ter nenhum movimento a favor deles. E uma imagem, às vezes, vale por 1000 relatórios, por 1000 palavras. Está aqui.
Their gardens are full of manioc, their main food. They're also growing bananas and papaya. And there are hundreds of anato trees. The tribe makes bright red body paint from the crushed seeds. Morales has been monitoring this tribe for 20 years, but he fears their lives are about to change for the worse. Illegal logging across the border in Peru is forcing uncontacted tribes there to flee.
De repente começou a aparecer uns isolados lá que não eram de lá. É óbvio, qual é o único lugar para onde esses isolados podem correr? É para lá de cá, não tem para onde mais correr.
But instead of expelling the loggers, Peru's government has suggested that uncontacted tribes don't exist at all.
É a única maneira da gente poder mostrar ao resto da humanidade que esses povos existem. É melhor isso do que ele entrar em contato com um bando de garimpeiro ou com um madeireiro, que vão matá-los na primeira vez que virem, não vão fotografar, vão atirar neles e matar.
And it's not just violence that puts uncontacted people at risk. Viruses, like the common cold, can kill them, and even wipe the tribes out completely.
A minha utopia seria que esses povos tivessem primeiro a opção de escolha. Né? Nós vamos continuar, nós vamos entrar em contato. É a terra, você conseguir o espaço e manter esse espaço livre. a interferência, que é a única forma dos índios isolados sobreviver. Não tem outra forma.
Now, I remember watching this video for the first time, and like the 13.6 million other viewers, I'm assuming, of course, I felt captivated. I thought the aerial footage was magical. I was curious. I was excited. I was intrigued. I wanted to know more. And then I was also motivated by the message of the video, which was, let's save these individuals. But then something about the video stuck out as problematic for me. And maybe you recognized it. Now, if we were in class, I would ask you to go ahead and do a quick write about what was strange or curious, or did you see or notice anything problematic about the video? Some students say no, and some students say yes. And when I press them on the issue, they say there was one part where the head researcher said they should choose whether or not to be contacted. And I would ask, well, why is this problematic? And they said, well, isn't that what they just did? Contacted them. So on one hand, we're saying here's a group that we need to give power to make decisions for themselves, but not without first making an initial decision about their exposure and contact. So in this video, we can think about muted group theory. Who really has voice or agency? Who really has decision-making power? Did the tribe have any decision-making power as to whether or not they would be contacted? Because based on the footage, the aerial footage and the photos, they suggest that the individuals who were being filmed, took somewhat of a defensive or curious posture, but they noticed that there was this flying object over them, and I doubt permission was asked to record them. So that brings up some interesting ethical choices there, or concerns, right? So, and there's even more on this. Again, muted group theory is a critical theory. It's considered a critical theory, not because it is critical or because it critiques, but because it falls under that paradigm, that umbrella of critical research focused on power dynamics, status quo, and dominant and non-dominant groups, specifically the communication patterns that occur between those groups. So, this theory also argues that non-dominant groups are often challenged to adapt their behaviors, and in our case, we can look at their communication styles, to really meet the demands of the status quo, or a man's world, for example. Well, what does this mean? It would mean that marginalized groups, in order to gain status or meet the status quo, would need to shift ways that they communicate to be more consistent with dominant culture values and patterns. Now, you can look at that in terms of patriarchal patterns, heteronormative language, race or linguistics, class, even ability. Now, we're not going to watch it on this video, but another link that I will feature on our course site is this one right here, and it's a parody, but it is how to speak like a newscaster. And so for the next week, I would ask you to go ahead and find a newscast, whether it's a podcast or local news, and just notice the ways in which the cadence or rhythm of the newscasters tend to follow particular patterns. Now, there's also consequences, by the way, for the non-dominant groups when they do make the concessions to fit the dominant group values or patterns of communication. So now I want you to think, for example, about female sportscasters, right? Live on the NFL field or live after the basketball game. And what do I mean by there are consequences? Well, we know from research that women sportscasters have an exceptionally hard time getting into the industry, namely because they have to prove themselves as worthy sportscasters in competition with their male counterparts. Now, that is changing a lot, actually, and we see more and more women on the field, so to speak. But again, we're not going to watch it here. I will include the link, but here we see this is a YouTube video where sports fans, male sports fans, are asked to read the mean tweets that female sportscasters received in response to their on air journalism. So, in other words, a female sportscaster would do a follow up interview after a basketball game, and then the tweets that she got on her Twitter were really quite vicious. And in this video, again, male sports fans are asked to read those tweets out loud to the female sportscasters. So that's really what I mean by consequences, right? It's sort of the I'm darned if I do, darned if I don't sort of behavior. So, how does this theory apply to some of our projects? Well, here are some of the applications. First of all, you could take a look at your local news or any group, for example, and ask yourself, do they look and sound like communities that they are meant to represent? Some examples from student projects in the past were, what voice do dreamers, for example, have in passing immigration legislation? Now, this is not a matter of right, wrong, good, bad, should or shouldn't they. It is simply a matter of understanding the power dynamic as it is communicated between the groups. Also, we could ask ourselves who traditionally speaks or legislates on behalf of women's reproductive rights. Do they, like the local news team, look like the group that they are seeking to represent? Another example could be who develops homeless shelters. And I have a quick story from a friend of mine. He lived in Southern California and does research on homeless shelters. And he was visiting a local one near LMU and found that it was empty. And when he asked the shelter director, what's going on here? The shelter director said, I'm not sure. We have comfortable beds, we have regular food offerings, we have resources, but nobody comes to our shelter, and we're finding far fewer people taking advantage than what we thought. So my friend looks around and he says, I have a question. Who designed the place? And the director looked at him confused and said, what do you mean, who designed it? And he said, well, who designed this space? Who was the architect at work here? And the director said, well, I'm not quite sure. Whoever, I guess, rented or constructed the building, the nonprofit group. And so my friend's point was to say, did you think to invite the homeless community into the shelter prior to its construction and ask them how they would like it to be designed? Because come to find out, research shows that a giant shared space for sleeping and dining is actually not what the homeless population wants, right? They had privacy needs too, and those were being neglected, if not completely eradicated from these spaces. So again, a good application of muted group theory. Oop, I jumped ahead. So that's it for this theory. Again, I'm going to be doing a series of short videos, so I hope this was helpful. Thanks.